There are moments in life when silence becomes heavier than words, when carrying a secret for decades feels like dragging chains through every year of your existence. For so long, I believed that keeping quiet was my only way to survive. I told myself that if I buried the truth deep enough, if I prayed hard enough, it might dissolve in the shadows. But silence never erased it. Silence only allowed it to take root inside me, twisting into shame, into fear, into a weight that never left my chest. Now, in the quiet of this convent, I find myself speaking into a stillness that has become my companion. I am no longer a child. I am no longer the frightened young girl who tried to hide in corners and prayed that someone might notice my pain. I am an older woman, and though my hands tremble, I know that telling my story is the only way I can finally let go of the burden that defined me for so many years. My name is Ruth Marlowe. I am a nun, and I have lived a long life of service, of prayer, of seeking peace. But beneath the habit I wear and the calm voice you hear, there is a hidden chapter, one that has shaped every choice I made, from the way I walked into the church to the way I see the world even now. This chapter began when I was a girl, long before I ever dreamed of taking vows, long before the world knew me as Sister Ruth. When people think of childhood, they imagine sunshine on summer days, laughter with siblings, warm meals shared at a family table. I had some of those moments too. I grew up in a small American town where church bells marked the hours and neighbors waved from their porches. My family was ordinary, working class, proud of the little we had. My father spent long hours on the road, working to keep food on the table. My mother managed the home, sewing, cooking, and watching over us. But even in those early years, shadows crept through the corners of my life. My father's absence left spaces where safety should have been, and it was in those spaces that the unthinkable began to grow. I was still just a girl, barely stepping out of childhood, when the person I should have been able to trust most in our home turned into my greatest fear. At first, it came as small things I did not fully understand. A lingering stare, words spoken with a strange edge, closeness that felt different than the rough play of brothers I had seen in other families. I remember the confusion more than anything else. I wanted to believe that family meant protection, that blood was a shield. But soon I learned that the bonds of blood can also be chains, binding you to those who hurt you most. The first time it happened, I froze. The kitchen was filled with ordinary sounds, the dripping of the faucet, the hum of cicadas outside the window, yet the world shifted in a way I could never undo. I wanted to scream, to run, but fear sealed my voice. And when it was over, the words spoken to me were like a curse. If you tell anyone, no one will believe you. They'll say you imagined it. They'll say it was your fault. From that day forward, my home was no longer a place of safety. It became a prison built of walls no one else could see. My brother's footsteps in the hallway made my stomach twist. Every time my father left on another long trip, I felt the clock start ticking toward dread. My mother, busy with chores and blind to what was happening, would look at me and ask if I was well, and I would nod, forcing a smile that felt like breaking glass. I carried this secret alone, burying it deeper each day, hoping it might disappear if I never spoke it aloud. But it did not disappear. It grew. It followed me into school where my grades slipped, where I sat silent at my desk while teachers asked what had changed. It followed me into church pews where I knelt and begged God to take away the nightmares, to make me invisible, to send me anywhere else but home. Even now, decades later, the memory of those first nights still makes my chest tighten. I do not need to describe every detail for you to understand the weight of what was done. The scars are not only on the body, they etch themselves into the spirit. They reshape how a girl sees herself, how she believes the world sees her. I began to think I was broken, unworthy, stained, and yet within me, A faint ember of hope refused to die. Perhaps it was faith. Perhaps it was the stubbornness of survival. Or perhaps it was the belief, however faint, that one day someone would listen, someone would believe me. I share this not because it is easy. It is not. I share it because silence nearly destroyed me. And for the first time in my life, I want my silence to end. My story truly begins in those years of stolen innocence, in that house where I learned fear instead of love. What followed would test the very core of who I was, pushing me into years of silence, then dragging me toward the moment when truth would erupt like a storm and nothing in my family would ever be the same again. But before that storm, there was the long night. The nights of waiting, of trembling, of begging heaven for mercy. The nights when I told myself, endure, survive, keep breathing. I was a child. And yet, in those nights, I felt older than time itself. When I look back on those early years, I sometimes wonder how two very different worlds could exist within the same roof. On one side, there was the ordinary picture of a working-class Catholic family. Evening prayers whispered before bed, the smell of my mother's bread cooling on the counter, neighbors greeting one another on Sunday mornings outside the parish. On the other side, hidden in silence, was the creeping darkness that began to poison my days and nights. I was the youngest daughter in my family, and in many ways, I was expected to carry lightness into our home. My father used to call me his little blessing, though he was rarely around to see me grow. He drove long hours on the road, sometimes gone for 2 or 3 weeks at a stretch. Each time he returned, I clung to him with relief, breathing easier while he was near. But soon enough, he would pack his bags again, and the safety I felt would vanish down the road with the rumble of his truck. My mother was a strong woman, but her strength was practical. She spent her days mending clothes for neighbors, scrubbing floors, and making sure food appeared on the table. Her eyes were always tired, her hands always red from washing. She believed that if the house was tidy and prayers were said, then all was well. She never imagined that beneath that surface, something was unraveling. It was my brother who first shifted the world beneath me. He was older, stronger, already carrying the swagger of a young man. At first, his changes seemed ordinary enough, teasing that lingered too long, a look that unsettled me though I couldn't explain why. I told myself it was just my imagination. Brothers sometimes teased their sisters, didn't they? But soon the teasing felt different. The air around him grew heavier, his presence more suffocating. One afternoon, I remember standing at the sink, rinsing the few cups from lunch. Outside, sunlight streamed through the window, golden and innocent. Yet when I felt him step close behind me, the warmth drained out of the room. His voice was low, different than before, and it made me shiver. He said things I didn't understand, words that felt too old for me, too strange. I pulled away, heart pounding, but his hand gripped my wrist with a quiet force. I remember the smell of soap on my skin mixing with the scent of his breath, and the terrible realization that the walls of our home were no longer walls of safety. I wish I could tell you I screamed, that someone came running, that my mother walked in just then and saw. But I was frozen, unable to move or speak. When he finally stepped back, his warning cut deeper than any blow could have. No one will ever believe you. That night, I lay awake staring at the ceiling, listening to the creak of the house. Every sound became a threat, the floorboard shifting, the door clicking, even the distant hum of my mother sewing in the other room. I prayed the rosary under my blanket, clutching the beads until they left marks on my palms. But no amount of prayer could erase the dread that filled me. The days that followed blurred into one another. I began to change without even realizing it. At school, my teachers noticed first. I had once been eager to answer questions, quick to raise my hand. Suddenly, I became silent, shrinking into the back of the classroom. My grades slipped. I avoided my friends, no longer laughing at their jokes or joining in their games. When a teacher pulled me aside and asked what was wrong, I mumbled about headaches, about being tired. How could I say the truth when even I could barely believe it myself? At home, I tried to make myself invisible. I wore baggy clothes, hoping they would hide me. I cut my hair shorter, thinking perhaps if I looked plain enough, I would disappear from his sight. I stopped singing to myself in the kitchen. I stopped smiling altogether, but the shadows only deepened. Each time my father left for another long trip, my stomach twisted with dread. Each time my mother stepped out to deliver laundry or buy groceries, I held my breath, counting the minutes until she returned. I told myself I just had to endure until I was older, until I could leave the house. But for a young girl, the years stretched like eternity. I remember one Sunday after Mass, a neighbor stopped me on the church steps. "Ruth, you're not as lively as you used to be," she said kindly, tucking a strand of hair behind my ear. "You used to be such a cheerful girl. Are you feeling well?" I forced a smile and said I was fine. But inside, my heart cried out for her to see, to know, to save me. And yet, she only patted my shoulder and walked on, leaving me with the crushing knowledge that my prison was invisible to everyone but me. The cruelest part of those shadows was how they twisted my own thoughts. I began to wonder if I was somehow to blame. Had I done something to provoke this? Was there something wrong with me? My brother's threats echoed in my ears, convincing me that even if I spoke, no one would believe me. The doubt became a poison, seeping into my sense of self. I no longer saw myself as a child deserving of love and protection. I saw myself as weak, dirty, unworthy. There were nights I lay in bed trembling, hearing footsteps outside my door. I pressed my body against the wall, wishing I could sink through it and vanish. Sometimes I whispered prayers until dawn, begging God to send angels to guard me. But the angels never came, at least not in the way I imagined. What came instead was survival, silent, desperate, but stubborn. Looking back now, I can see that even in those darkest shadows, a spark of resistance remained. I did not understand it then. I only knew that I had to endure. That endurance became my armor, thin though it was. But endurance alone cannot protect a soul forever. The shadows that began to creep in during those years soon thickened into a storm that would tear apart my family, shake the very foundations of my faith, and leave scars that time alone could not heal. The house that once echoed with ordinary sounds of family life soon became a place I dreaded. Every floorboard creak seemed to hold a threat. Every shadow in the hallway carried fear. What should have been a home felt instead like a cage where I was both prisoner and prey. My brother's grip over me did not end with that first violation of trust. It only grew. At first, I thought it might stop if I avoided him, if I stayed quiet, if I slipped into corners unnoticed. But silence did not protect me. In fact, it seemed to feed his confidence. The more I hid, the more he hunted. He learned my patterns the way a fox studies a rabbit's trail. He knew when my mother would be gone to deliver clothes for neighbors. He knew when my father's long trips meant there was no guardian under the roof. He even began to draw the other brothers into his orbit, whispering to them, pulling them into his twisted secret. Soon, it was not just one set of footsteps I feared in the hallway, but 3. I cannot describe every detail of what followed, nor do I need to. What matters is the feeling it left behind, the certainty that I had no control, that my body and spirit were no longer mine. Their threats bound me tighter than any chain. If you say a word, no one will believe you. You'll be called a liar. They'll say it was your fault. Those sentences rang in my ears like a bell of doom. Days blurred into one another, marked not by school lessons or chores, but by the dread of when my mother might step out again, leaving me exposed. My grades at school sank further. Teachers scolded me for not paying attention. Friends drifted away as I no longer laughed or joined their games. At recess I sat alone, staring at the dirt, pretending to be invisible. At home, I tried everything to shield myself. I dragged a dresser against my bedroom door, but one afternoon it was shoved aside as if it were made of paper. I locked windows, I kept to the attic, I made excuses to leave the house and wander the streets until dusk. But nothing truly worked. The walls that should have been my protection only echoed back my helplessness. I began to change in ways even my mother could not ignore. My face grew pale, my body thin. I had deep shadows under my eyes from sleepless nights. I ate little, for food seemed tasteless when dread was lodged in my throat. My mother would press a hand to my forehead and ask if I was ill. I answered yes, hoping sickness might explain what I could not speak. She suggested doctors, but then money was tight, and my father was away, so her worries slipped back under chores and laundry. At church, I knelt among the parishioners and begged God to deliver me. The crucifix above the altar seemed to look down with pity. The hymns felt hollow in my ears, but I still clung to them, whispering prayers late into the night. Please, Lord, make it stop. Please send someone to help me. The weight of shame pressed heavily on me. I wondered if perhaps I had somehow caused this, if I had smiled at the wrong time, spoken the wrong way. In childish confusion, I blamed myself. Each morning when I looked in the mirror, I saw not the face of a young girl, but the reflection of guilt that was never mine to carry. My brothers, cruel in their power, even began to twist my parents' trust against me. At the dinner table, one would casually remark, "I saw Ruth talking with boys by the corner store today." Another would add, "She's becoming too flirty, Mom. You should watch her." Their words were daggers, shaping suspicion in my mother's eyes. I would protest, deny, plead the truth, but their voices outnumbered mine. And so I became not only silenced, but discredited in the very home where I longed for belief. The cruelty was not only in their actions, but in how they tried to fracture my spirit. They mocked me for my silence, taunted me with the knowledge that my father would believe them before he would believe me. "Who do you think Dad will trust?" one sneered. "His 3 sons or the daughter who acts so strange?" That manipulation hollowed me from within, convincing me that truth itself had no power. I learned to live in fragments. At school, I pretended at normalcy, though my grades told the truth of decline. At church, I whispered prayers, though I felt unworthy even to be in God's house. At home, I drifted like a ghost through rooms I once knew, moving carefully so as not to awaken the shadows that stalked me. The toll on my body began to show in more frightening ways. Strange bleeding appeared at times when it should not. Fevers came and went. Pains curled through my stomach so sharply that I sometimes fainted, but I kept silent, terrified of what would happen if doctors looked too closely or if my mother asked too many questions. I carried the suffering alone, too afraid to name it aloud. I told myself that perhaps this was my fate, a cross I had to bear quietly. Children think in strange ways when terror rules their lives. I thought maybe God was testing me or punishing me for some unseen sin. That belief nearly crushed me because it convinced me that there was no escape, that even heaven had turned its face away. Yet deep down, buried under layers of fear, a spark of resistance still flickered. Every time I pulled a dresser against my door, every time I slipped out to wander the streets instead of staying home, every whispered prayer for deliverance, these were small rebellions, proof that I still longed for freedom. My brothers might have stolen my sense of safety, but they had not completely stolen my will to survive. Still, I could not break free on my own. The prison had become too strong, the silence too heavy. I was fading, and I did not know how much longer my body or spirit could endure. It was only a matter of time before that silence cracked. And when it did, it would bring chaos that no one in my family could escape. There comes a moment in every storm when the wind no longer whispers but howls, when the clouds tear open and the sky itself seems to collapse. For me, that breaking point arrived after months of silence. when the weight of secrets pressed so hard upon my body that it began to give way. I had grown thinner than ever, pale as parchment, my eyes ringed with shadows. Some days I barely had the strength to rise from bed, yet I forced myself, moving like a ghost through the rooms of our house, unwilling to give my mother more reason to suspect. But my body could not endure what my heart was forced to carry. One evening, after a particularly cruel day of threats and torment, a sharp pain tore through my stomach. I remember stumbling into the bathroom, clutching my side, then collapsing onto the cold tile floor. The pain was blinding, as if my very insides were being torn apart. When I looked down, I saw blood seeping across the floor. A scream caught in my throat, but no sound came. Darkness closed in, and I lost myself. I woke some time later to my father's voice, shaking me gently, calling my name with desperation. He had returned early from a trip by some mercy of God. I felt his arms lifting me, his tears falling on my face as he carried me like a child. My mother's cries echoed in the background, half in panic, half in confusion. The world spun around me, and then the blinding lights of a hospital ceiling swam into view. Doctors moved quickly, their words blurring into one another. Internal trauma. Heavy bleeding. Emergency surgery. I drifted in and out of consciousness, catching fragments of conversations. But one phrase I heard clearly, spoken in a voice both grave and certain. This girl has been a victim of repeated abuse. We must call the authorities immediately. In that instant, everything I had buried threatened to erupt. My father, who had always been calm, lost control. I heard him shouting, his voice cracking with grief and fury. Who did this to my daughter? Who? Nurses tried to hold him back, while my mother sat weeping in a corner, rocking herself as though the truth were too terrible to face. Then came the gentle hand of a social worker, a young woman with kind eyes who sat beside me. My name is Margaret, she said softly. I'm here to help. Can you tell me who hurt you? The truth balanced on my lips like a fragile bird. I wanted to scream my brother's names, to finally hand over the weight that had broken me. But when I turned my head, I saw my father's face, broken, trembling, destroyed already by what little he knew. I saw my mother, aged years in one night, clutching her hands as though in prayer. And I thought, if I speak, I will shatter them forever. So I lied. My voice barely a whisper, I said. It was some men. Strangers, on the way home from school. I didn't know them. The social worker frowned, sensing the hole in my words, but she only nodded gently. Thank you for telling me, she said. It was the first of many lies I would tell in the weeks that followed. The surgery saved my life, but it could not mend the wounds of my spirit. I heard the doctors warning my parents that the damage inside me was severe, that I might never have children, that the scars would remain. I lay there, listening, tears sliding down my cheeks, wondering if even my future had been stolen. My father never left my side. He held my hand while I slept, his once strong shoulders hunched with grief. I will find who did this, princess, he whispered over and over. Even if I must turn the whole town upside down. His words broke my heart, because the enemy he sought was not out there, but under his own roof. When the police came, their questions pressed like heavy stones. Where had it happened? What did they look like? How many were there? I answered each with vagueness, weaving the lie tighter. They looked at me with suspicion, exchanging glances, knowing I held something back. Yet I remained silent, trapped by fear, by shame, by the thought of destroying what was left of my family. The week in the hospital passed slowly. My body began to heal, but my nights were filled with nightmares. I woke screaming, drenched in sweat, seeing shadows of brothers at my bedside. Nurses soothed me with gentle words, but I knew the real ghosts would follow me long after I left. One evening, when my father had stepped out to fetch something and my mother had gone home to rest, The door creaked open. My youngest brother entered quietly, pale and hollow-eyed. For a moment fear froze me, but then I saw his tears. "I'm sorry, Ruth," he whispered. "I never wanted any of this. They forced me." His voice cracked, and he sobbed like a child. I could not answer him. My throat burned with anger, sorrow, confusion. He begged me not to tell, not to let Father know. His words tumbled out in desperation. "If he discovers the truth, he will kill us. He will kill me." Then, as quickly as he had come, he slipped out, leaving me shaking with rage and despair. His apology, whether true or not, was another chain binding me to silence. I turned my face to the wall and cried until exhaustion pulled me back into sleep. By the time I returned home, everything had changed. My father had painted my room a soft yellow, trying to make it feel like a new beginning. He installed a lock on my door and handed me the key solemnly. "No one enters without your permission. No one," he said. His voice carried the weight of a vow, but a fresh coat of paint and a sturdy lock could not erase what had been done. The walls still held the echoes of nights I wished I could forget. The very air seemed heavy with secrets. My father searched the town for imaginary attackers. My mother busied herself with meals and tidying, and I moved quietly through a house that was no longer a home. I had crossed the breaking point, and though I had survived, the storm was only beginning. Returning home from the hospital should have been a relief, but instead it felt like stepping back into a battlefield disguised as a house. My father had tried to make everything new. Fresh paint on the walls, new sheets on the bed, even a small vase of daisies on the dresser. He wanted me to believe in a fresh start, but I knew too well that no brush of paint could erase the memories soaked into those walls. He promised me safety with the key to my bedroom, swearing that no one would ever enter without my permission again. I nodded, grateful for his protection, but inside I knew the promise was fragile. My brothers still lived under the same roof. Their silence was louder than any shout. They avoided me now, slipping in and out of rooms without meeting my eyes. And yet I could feel their glances, sharp and heavy, whenever Father's back was turned. The house itself grew tense. My mother walked on tiptoe, as though even the sound of her footsteps might shatter what little peace remained. At mealtimes the air was thick with unsaid words. My father, always steady before, now seemed restless. He spent hours at the police station, talking with detectives, searching for the strangers I had invented. At night, he sat beside me until I fell asleep, his hand wrapped around mine, whispering, "Nothing bad will happen again, Ruth. Never again." But I could see it in his eyes. Doubt. He didn't say it aloud, not yet, but suspicion lingered like a shadow he couldn't shake. My brother's nervous glances, their quick tempers, their sudden disappearances, it did not escape him. Outside the home, whispers spread like wildfire. Small towns carry stories quickly, and soon everyone knew I had been attacked. Teachers treated me differently, speaking with hushed tones, their eyes filled with pity. Students pointed and whispered in corridors, "That's the girl." They say it was a gang from out of town. They say she almost died. Some avoided me as though I carried a sickness. Others stared with cruel curiosity, hungry for details I would never share. I longed for invisibility. At recess, I sat alone beneath the trees, pretending to study my books, while in truth I was only counting the minutes until the bell rang. My friends didn't know how to approach me anymore. Their laughter seemed distant, belonging to a world I no longer recognized. The isolation deepened my despair. I began to believe the whispers, to internalize the pity, to see myself not as Ruth, but as the girl who was attacked. My identity shrank to that single shadowed truth. At home, nights were haunted. I woke screaming from dreams that felt more like memories replayed. My father would rush in, holding me until the shaking passed. Sometimes my cries were so violent that the doctor prescribed medicine to calm me. but the pills only trapped me deeper in nightmares, making it impossible to wake. I soon stopped taking them, preferring restless nights over dream-filled prisons. My brothers lived as though walking a tightrope. Anthony, the oldest, tried to act normal, even kind. He offered to help with homework, asked if I wanted to watch television, pretended concern. His words were honey-laced with poison. Joseph kept his distance, silent at meals, never raising his eyes from his plate. And Robert, the youngest, looked at me with a guilt that gnawed at him, his thin frame and hollow eyes betraying sleepless nights of his own. But guilt did not erase what he had done. One evening, months after my return from the hospital, I overheard my parents in their bedroom. Their voices, usually hushed, had risen in heated argument. "There's something wrong with this whole story, Connie," my father said, his voice sharp. "Can't you see it? The boys are acting strangely. They avoid her eyes. They snap at every question. And Ruth, look at her. She doesn't eat, she doesn't smile, she hardly speaks." My mother's voice trembled. "What are you suggesting, George? That your own sons, our boys, could have done this?" "She's my daughter too," my father thundered back. "And I will not ignore what my eyes are telling me." I held my breath in the hallway, tears stinging my eyes. For the first time, I realized he was close, so close, to uncovering the truth. And yet, the thought of it terrified me. If he knew, what would become of us? Would he break apart? Would he destroy them? Would our family be shattered beyond repair? That night, I pressed my forehead against the cool wood of my bedroom door and prayed, "Lord, give me strength. Show me what to do. Keep my father from losing himself in this storm." The days that followed felt heavier. My father's eyes lingered longer on my brother's, questions poised on his lips but left unsaid. My mother busied herself with chores, clinging to denial like a lifeline, and I drifted between them all, a silent witness to the cracks widening in our home. At school, the whispers grew louder. I heard students betting on the story. Was it one man or two? Were they locals or strangers? The lies I had spoken to protect my family had grown into rumors I could no longer control, and the guilt of those lies pressed against my chest like iron chains. Everywhere I turned, I felt watched, by neighbors, by classmates, by the very walls of my house. It seemed the truth was pressing in on me, demanding to be spoken, but fear held my mouth shut. I began to realize that silence had not protected me after all. It had only deepened the prison, and sooner or later, that prison would collapse, taking everyone inside with it. The walls of silence in our home could not hold forever. My father's suspicion grew sharper with each passing day, and my brother's nervous glances betrayed them even when their mouths stayed shut. It was as though we were all trapped in a house swollen with secrets, waiting for the moment it would split apart. That moment came on an ordinary evening, though I have learned there is no such thing as ordinary when storms are brewing. The dinner table was set simply, pot roast potatoes, a loaf of bread. My mother bowed her head to lead grace, her voice trembling through the words. I kept my eyes fixed on my plate, willing the food to disappear. My father's eyes, however, were fixed elsewhere. He was watching Anthony. Then Joseph. Then Robert. His gaze moved from one son to the other, as though searching for confirmation of the thoughts already gnawing at him. Finally, he set down his fork with a sharp clang. "I've had enough of this," he said, his voice low but trembling with fury. "I want the truth." The room went still. My mother's hands froze above the table. My brothers stiffened, their faces pale. My heart pounded so loudly I was certain everyone could hear it. Father's fist struck the table. "This story about strangers on the road, I don't believe it. Not anymore. I know my daughter. I know when she's lying." He turned his eyes to me, and I felt their weight like fire. "Ruth, tell me now, what really happened?" Tears sprang to my eyes before words could form. My mouth opened, but no sound came. The silence itself was an answer. Anthony leapt to his feet, his chair clattering to the floor. "She's making things up. You can't believe her." His voice cracked with panic. Sit down! Father roared, his voice shaking the walls. He turned to me again, his expression breaking apart, torn between rage and grief. Ruth, look at me. Did your brothers do this? I tried to shake my head, to cling to the lie I had built so carefully, but my strength failed. My lips trembled, and in a whisper barely audible, I spoke. Yes. The word cracked open the air like thunder. My mother gasped, her hands flying to her mouth. My father staggered back as though struck by a blow. He looked from me to them, horror dawning in his eyes. You monsters, he growled, his voice trembling with fury I had never heard before. You are my sons, and you have destroyed my daughter. He lunged across the table, grabbing Anthony by the collar. The room erupted, chairs crashing, my mother screaming, my brothers shouting. I pressed myself against the wall, sobbing, unable to watch, yet unable to look away. Father's fists rained down, years of betrayal unleashed in a single moment. My mother clung to his arm, begging him to stop, but his grief had broken loose into violence. The sound of Anthony's pleas, Joseph's shouts, Robert's cries, all tangled in a storm that shook our home to its foundations. Then came the sound of the front door, the shouts of neighbors who had heard the commotion, and soon the sharp command of police officers filling the air. Lights flashed through the windows. In an instant, the storm spilled beyond our walls. The officers pulled my father back, restraining him as he shouted words he could never take back. My brothers, pale and trembling, were forced to their feet, hands bound as they were led toward the door. My mother collapsed to the floor, wailing prayers into her apron, and I, frozen, shaking, was led gently by one of the officers to the porch. It's all right now, he whispered. You're safe. But I did not feel safe. I felt hollow, empty. The truth was no longer hidden, yet it had not brought peace. It had shattered us. At the police station, I gave my statement through tears. The words felt like shards of glass in my mouth, each syllable cutting as it left me. The officers listened carefully, writing it all down, while my father sat in the corner, his head in his hands. He could not look at me. He could not look at them. By the time the night ended, my brothers were behind bars, my father was broken, and my mother sat silent, her face gray with shock. Our family had been torn apart, and there was no stitching it back together. When we returned home in the early hours of morning, the house felt like a tomb. The food still sat on the table, cold and untouched, plates scattered where they had fallen. I walked past the wreckage of chairs and broken dishes, climbed the stairs, and closed myself into my room. For the first time, I turned the key in the new lock and felt the weight of it in my hand. The silence that followed was different than before. It was no longer the silence of secrets, but the silence of devastation. The truth was out, and though part of me was relieved, another part wondered if speaking it had destroyed more than it saved. That night, lying in bed with swollen eyes, I whispered into the dark, God, have I done right? Or have I doomed us all? The storm had broken, and none of us would ever be the same. When the storm finally passed, what remained was not peace, but ruin. Our home, once filled with the ordinary rhythm of family life, now felt like a hollow shell, stripped of warmth. My brothers were gone, taken away in the flashing lights of police cars, yet their absence was not a relief. It was a wound, raw and gaping, that bled into every corner of the house. My father became a ghost of himself. He no longer spoke with the authority that once steadied our family. He moved through the rooms like a man lost in his own house, shoulders bent, eyes vacant. Sometimes I caught him staring at the front door for hours, as though waiting for his sons to walk back through it. His grief was sharp, but behind it was a guilt I could see plain as day. The guilt of a father who had not protected his daughter, who had missed the truth beneath his own roof. My mother collapsed inward. She spent her days in silence, sitting at the kitchen table with her rosary beads sliding endlessly through her fingers. Her prayers sounded more like sobs, mumbled pleas for forgiveness, for mercy, for a miracle that could undo what had been done. The meals grew simpler, sometimes forgotten altogether, and the house that had once been neat and orderly now sagged under neglect. The neighbors knew, of course. In a small town, nothing remains hidden for long. Whispers drifted through church pews, across grocery aisles, along sidewalks. I could feel eyes following me wherever I went, pitying, judging, questioning. Some people avoided me, as though tragedy were contagious. Others leaned in close, fishing for details I could not bear to give. At school, the weight was unbearable. Teachers spoke to me with voices too soft, too careful, as if I might break apart at any moment. Students whispered in corners, staring as I walked past. "That's her," they said. "That's the girl whose brothers are in prison." I became a spectacle, a story, stripped of the personhood I once had. My desk felt like an island, isolated in a sea of voices I could no longer join. Nights were the hardest. The silence of the house pressed down on me until I could hardly breathe. I dreamed of the storm again and again, the shouting, the fists, the flashing lights, and each time I woke trembling, certain that someone was at my door. Even with the lock secured, I never felt safe. Safety, once broken, is not easily mended. I tried to pray, but my words fell flat. I sat in the pews of our parish, staring at the crucifix, asking God why He had allowed such ruin to enter my life. Was I cursed? Was my family being punished for hidden sins? The answers never came. Faith felt like a distant memory, something I clung to out of habit rather than belief. One afternoon, my father sat me down at the kitchen table. His eyes were hollow, ringed with exhaustion, but his voice was steady for the first time in weeks. "Ruth," he said, "I need you to know that none of this is your fault. Do you hear me? Not 1 ounce of it. What they did, it was evil, but you are my daughter, and you are blameless." I wanted to believe him, but his words slid off me like water on stone. Deep down, the lies my brothers had fed me for years still lingered. "No one will believe you. It's your fault. You're weak." Their poison had seeped into my very bones. I nodded at my father, forcing a small smile, but inside, the doubt remained. The community did not make it easier. Letters arrived at our house, some with sympathy, others with venom. One anonymous note called me a liar, accusing me of destroying my family for attention. Another suggested my father should have handled matters privately, that dragging shame into public view only dishonored us all. Each cruel word carved deeper wounds into a heart already bleeding. Eventually, the whispers and stares grew too much. My father decided we could not stay in that town. One morning, he announced that we were moving, packing what little we had left of dignity into boxes, and leaving behind the house that had once been our world. I did not argue. Part of me was relieved, desperate to escape the endless eyes and whispers. Another part mourned the loss of even that broken home, for it was still the place where I had once known laughter, once felt safe before it all unraveled. The new town was quieter, larger, where people did not know our story right away. But even there, I could not escape myself. I carried the past within me, like a shadow stitched to my skin. I flinched at sudden footsteps. I avoided eye contact with strangers. I built walls around myself, determined never again to let anyone close enough to hurt me. My parents tried to rebuild in their own ways. My father found work, throwing himself into long hours of labor as though sweat could wash away his sorrow. My mother clung tighter to her prayers, attending daily mass, kneeling so long her knees bruised. But the cracks in our family remained. We were together, yet shattered, and I, the daughter at the center of it all, felt both the cause and the consequence. It did not matter how many times my father told me I was not to blame. It did not matter how often my mother whispered prayers for my healing. I felt branded, marked forever by what had happened. Looking back, I see that these were the years when despair nearly swallowed me whole. I had survived the storm, but in the wreckage I lost pieces of myself. Trust, innocence, joy, all seemed gone. I walked through life like a hollow vessel, carrying a story too heavy for my young shoulders. The storm had passed, yes, but the ruins it left behind were my new reality. The move to a new town was supposed to be a fresh start, but the past does not simply vanish because you change your address. We left behind the house that had collapsed under the weight of secrets, yet the ghosts came with me, carried in my mind and stitched into my heart. The new neighborhood was larger and less familiar. People nodded politely when we arrived, curious about the quiet family who seemed to appear out of nowhere. They did not know our story, not yet. For a brief moment I thought perhaps I could be invisible here, a girl without a past. But the human spirit cannot shed scars like an old coat. Wherever I went, the weight followed. At school, I tried to blend in. I sat near the back of classrooms, careful not to draw attention. I avoided friendships, afraid that if anyone got close, they might sense the truth I carried. When other girls whispered secrets about crushes or dances, I stayed silent, pretending to be shy. In truth, I no longer remembered how to be carefree. My laughter had withered, replaced by the constant vigilance of someone always looking over her shoulder. The teachers noticed my withdrawn nature, of course. Some thought I was simply a quiet child, adjusting to a new environment. Others pressed me with questions. "Do you like your new town, Ruth? Are you settling in well?" I nodded each time, offering empty reassurances, because how could I explain the shadows that haunted me? At night, the silence of our new home was unbearable. I would wake from nightmares drenched in sweat, hearing echoes of voices that were not really there. My brothers were locked away, but their presence lingered in my mind. In dreams, they stood in my doorway, whispering the same words that had once bound me to silence. "No one will ever believe you." I would wake gasping, clutching the sheets, certain for a moment that I was still their prisoner. Then came the letters. At first, they were addressed to my parents, neat handwriting on thin paper from the county jail. I tried not to look, but curiosity gnawed at me. I caught glimpses as my mother folded them quickly, hiding them in a drawer. One day when she stepped away, I opened one. The words were twisted apologies, claims of regret, pleas for forgiveness. But threaded through them was manipulation, subtle reminders of the silence they had demanded of me, disguised as sorrow. Later, a letter arrived with my name written on the front. My hands shook as I unfolded it. Inside were words from Robert, the youngest, the one who had once whispered apologies by my hospital bed. "I never wanted this, Ruth," he wrote. "They pushed me into it. I'm sorry. Please don't hate me forever. I read it once, then tore it into pieces." But the damage was done. The words clung to me, stirring confusion and conflict. Did remorse lessen what had been done? Did regret erase scars? Part of me wanted to believe he meant it. Another part knew that even sorrow could not undo the years of pain. Each letter became a test of my strength. Some I ignored, some I burned, some I hid away where no one else would see. My parents pretended the letters did not exist, though I saw the pain in their eyes when they arrived. Silence became our unspoken agreement. We would not mention them aloud. In the quiet of the convent where I now reflect, I can see those years as a crucible. I was fragile, yes, but somewhere within me, resilience was being forged. Every nightmare I survived, every letter I resisted, every day I walked into school despite the whispers, it was proof that I had not been entirely broken. Still, I struggled with faith. I knelt in church, mouthing prayers, but they felt hollow. My lips moved, yet my heart was numb. I wondered if God had abandoned me, or if perhaps I was too stained for his love. The sermons about forgiveness rang cruel in my ears. How could I forgive those who had stolen everything? How could I forgive myself for the lies I had told to protect them, lies that nearly destroyed me? And yet, amidst the doubt, a faint spark remained. I remember one day sitting in a quiet chapel after school, the stained glass windows spilling colors across the pews. An older nun noticed me, sitting alone, and gently placed her hand on my shoulder. She said nothing, only offered a small smile before walking on. That simple gesture pierced the fog of despair. For the first time in years, I felt seen, not as a victim, not as a scandal, but as a soul. It was then I began to imagine a different path. I did not yet know it would lead me into religious life, but the seed had been planted. The thought that I might one day reclaim my story, that I might turn suffering into service, flickered faintly in the distance. But at that time, the shadows still pressed heavily. The letters kept coming, the nightmares lingered, and the silence weighed on me. I was alive, yes, but survival is not the same as living. I walked through each day like a hollow figure, yearning for a freedom I could not yet name. Looking back now, I see those years as the long night after the storm. The house was quieter, the town less cruel, but the war raged on inside me. It would take many more trials, many more tears, before I would find a way to step into the light. For many years after the storm, I lived as though in exile, present in body but absent in spirit. I went through the motions of school, of chores, of sitting quietly in the pew each Sunday, but my heart remained locked in the prison built during my childhood. It seemed impossible that anything good could grow from such broken soil. And yet, even in the darkest earth, seeds lie hidden, waiting for the right season to rise. The first seed of healing came not in a grand revelation, but in a quiet kindness. I was 15 then, sitting alone in the back pew of our parish after school. I had slipped inside to escape the noise of the world, not to pray. I had long since stopped expecting answers from heaven, but simply to sit in the stillness. My shoulders slumped, my eyes downcast, I felt invisible, as though I could vanish and no one would notice. It was then that Sister Agnes, one of the older nuns at the parish, walked past. She paused when she saw me, her gentle eyes softening with recognition. Instead of asking questions, instead of pressing me for explanations, she simply laid a hand on my shoulder and said, "You are not alone, child." Those words, simple as they were, cracked something inside me. For the first time in years, I felt seen not as a burden, not as a scandal, but as a soul. From then on, Sister Agnes became a quiet presence in my life. She never demanded confessions, never pried into wounds I was not ready to expose. Instead, she offered steady kindness, a cup of tea after school, a book pressed into my hands, an invitation to help with simple tasks around the church. In her company, I began to breathe more easily. I began to imagine that perhaps I was not irreparably broken. It was also during those years that I discovered the power of writing. At first, it was in secret. I kept a small notebook hidden under my mattress, filling its pages with words I could never speak aloud. I wrote letters to God, angry ones and pleading ones, letters full of questions with no answers. I wrote about the nightmares, about the guilt, about the way my heart longed for peace but could not find it. Over time, the pages filled, and I began to see patterns in my own pain. Writing gave shape to the chaos inside me. It was not healing in itself, but it was the beginning of a map toward it. School remained difficult, but I pressed on. My teachers noticed my effort, and a few encouraged me to think about college. At first, the idea seemed laughable. Who would I be in a place like that? But something inside me stirred. Perhaps education could be a way forward, a way to carve a life not defined by what had been done to me. As the years passed, the letters from my brothers continued, though less frequently. I ignored most of them, yet the weight of their existence lingered. One in particular arrived on my 16th birthday, scrawled in Robert's familiar hand. "I am sorry, Ruth, truly. I hope you can forgive me someday." I read it once, then placed it in the bottom of a drawer. Forgiveness felt impossible then, but a small part of me wondered if one day, perhaps, it would not. By 17, I began helping regularly at the parish school, tutoring younger children in reading. Their laughter, their innocent questions, their trust in me, it softened something hardened in my chest. For the first time, I experienced the joy of being needed, not because of my silence, but because of my presence. Teaching them felt like glimpsing another version of myself, the girl I might have been if innocence had not been stolen. Faith, too, began to stir again, though haltingly. I remember kneeling one evening in the chapel, whispering the same words I had prayed as a child. "Lord, please help me." But this time, I did not feel the void pressing back. Instead, I felt a flicker of warmth, fragile but real, like a candle flame in the dark. It did not erase my pain, but it reminded me that I was still here, still breathing, still capable of seeking more. College came sooner than I expected. With scholarships and the encouragement of teachers, I found myself stepping onto a campus filled with strangers. At first I was overwhelmed, certain my scars would show. But slowly, I found refuge in books, in learning, in shaping my voice through writing and study. Each class I completed felt like reclaiming a piece of the future I thought had been stolen forever. During those years, I also encountered mentors who deepened my path. One professor, a gentle man with a love for literature, encouraged me to write not only my pain, but also my hopes. "Stories can heal," he said, "even your own." His words lingered, pushing me to imagine that perhaps my story had purpose beyond suffering. It was in those college years that the thought of religious life became more than a flicker. Watching the sisters who taught and served, I saw women who had given their entire lives not to silence, but to love. Their laughter was genuine, their compassion boundless. I began to wonder, could I, too, take what was broken in me and shape it into service for others? Could I, too, find freedom in a life given to God? It was not a sudden decision. It grew quietly, like a seed watered over time. But one evening, walking past the chapel, I paused and felt a certainty deep in my bones. My life was meant to be more than survival. It was meant to be witness. Looking back, I see those years as the turning of the tide. I was not yet healed, not fully. I still carried nightmares, doubts, scars, but I had taken the first steps toward reclaiming my life, toward believing that even broken ground can give rise to flowers. The seeds of healing had been planted, and soon they would grow into a calling that would shape the rest of my life. When I look back on the road that brought me here, I sometimes marvel that I am still standing at all. The path was jagged with sorrow, lined with shadows that nearly swallowed me whole. And yet, through grace, through endurance, through the faint sparks of hope that refused to die, I have lived not only to survive, but to serve. What was once only pain has become testimony. What was once silence has become witness. The decision to enter religious life did not come as a thunderbolt, but as a steady unfolding. After years of study and the patient guidance of mentors, I realized that God was not absent in my suffering. He was present in every breath I managed to take, in every step I refused to surrender. The sisters who had shown me kindness became examples of what was possible, lives rooted not in bitterness, but in love. I wanted that. I wanted to turn the ashes of my past into something that might warm another soul shivering in the cold. When I first donned the habit, I felt a strange lightness, as though laying down the burden of who I had been told I was. For so long, I had been the broken girl, the daughter of scandal, the victim. Now I was Sister Ruth, a servant of God, a woman with purpose. The name did not erase my scars, but it reframed them. They were no longer marks of shame, but reminders of where I had been carried, proof of what I had endured. In the years that followed, my vocation became my healing ground. I poured myself into teaching, guiding children whose laughter reminded me of the girl I once was. Every time I helped a struggling student sound out a word, every time I wiped away a child's tears, I felt the restoration of something inside me. It was as though God was handing back pieces of my stolen childhood through the smiles of those I served. I also found myself drawn to listening, to the quiet confessions of young women burdened by secrets, to the weary sighs of mothers carrying silent griefs, to the whispered prayers of the broken. I knew too well the weight of silence, and so I made it my vow to hear what others could not say aloud. Sometimes I had no answers to give, but presence itself became a balm. To sit with someone in their sorrow is to remind them they are not alone. And yes, the past still visited me. Nightmares came even in my convent cell, though less often than before. Letters from my brothers arrived even years later, sometimes filtered through legal notices, sometimes through desperate pleas. I never responded. I carried them in prayer, but not in dialogue. Forgiveness, I learned, does not mean returning to the chains that once bound you. It means laying the weight of vengeance at God's feet and choosing to live free. When my parents passed, my mother first, my father some years after, I felt a wave of grief mingled with release. They had carried their own heavy burdens to the grave, and I prayed they had found the mercy they sought. I stood at their funerals, my habit rustling in the wind, and whispered the same prayer I whisper now, Lord, receive them. Heal what we could not. Now, as an older woman, I sit in the quiet of the convent archives, my life spread out behind me like pages of a book. I have known pain few can imagine. I have known despair that almost claimed me. But I have also known love, the fierce love of a father who fought for me when the truth broke free, the steadfast love of mentors who guided me, the boundless love of God who never abandoned me even when I thought he had. I speak now not for pity, but for purpose. I tell my story because I know there are others who carry secrets in silence, who believe no one would ever believe them, who fear that speaking will shatter everything. To you I say this, silence may feel safer, but it will crush you from within. Your story matters, your voice matters, and you are not to blame for the harm others chose to inflict. If my life proves anything, it is that brokenness does not have the final word. Scars can become maps that lead us to compassion. Wounds can become witness that helps another survive. What was once my deepest shame is now my testimony of survival, of resilience, of God's power to bring light from the darkest night. I remain Sister Ruth Marlowe. I remain a woman who was once a frightened girl, locked in silence, but who found her voice at last. And as I end this confession, I leave you with the truth that sustained me through every trial. Pain may shape us, but it does not have to define us. Healing is possible, hope is real, and even from the deepest wounds, new life can grow.